I'm recording this on September the 18th, 2012, a few days after Kurt Eichenwald, a reporter for Vanity Fair, an editor rather, wrote an op-ed piece that appeared in the New York Times on September the 11th, just a few days ago. And it was based on a series of interviews and research to declassified files that Eichenwald did that threw new light on the behavior of the Bush administration. Uh, Eichenwald saw both classified documents, and in his interviews with administration officials, came to the conclusion that the administration had more foreknowledge of the threat posed by Al Qaeda than has been previously recognized, and that this foreknowledge was particularly acute in the months just before 9/11. Now, the news story that I saw was it was linked to on the edge, rather discreetly, on the edge of a story that in turn was not given very much attention at the homepage where I get most of my news. And so, in effect, the Eichenwald story was buried by the news source that I usually get first, which is the homepage for my email server. And that tendency to just ignore what really I think is a bombshell, a major story, not a minor story, is a reflection of what is happening in American society generally and has been happening for 11 years. In fact, one could say that this tendency to ignore the real story, to not give it the attention that it deserves, to not make it a headline piece that gets legs and keeps receiving attention for weeks or months on end within the news cycle, is something that's been going on for 20 years. And that time frame is the context of U.S. wars in the Middle East since Gulf War One, arguably going back a little further even, during the U.S. supplying of armaments to the Taliban during its struggle against the Soviet Union when it was fighting in Afghanistan. So the full breadth of what's going on is something that many Americans don't see. And this perhaps helps explain the really sort of weird, strangely passive attitude that so many Americans seem to have about these wars, which are now occurring still on a low-grade scale in Iraq. Although the Americans are officially pulled out, they're very much on the sidelines, watching very carefully. And of course, the Americans are still deeply involved in Afghanistan. These wars are ruinously expensive. They are strange wars. They're unnecessary wars. They're taking place on the other side of the planet in countries that pose no real active threat to American soil. And yet at the same time they're accepted. One has to ask why. Well, one reason why is because of the caliber of the news coverage that they receive and the way that they are contextualized. Now, interestingly, one reaction to the Eichenwald piece came from Ari Fleischer, who was press secretary to George Bush. And Fleischer referred to Eichenwald as a 9/11 truther, put down, and that was a play on words on, of course, that group of anti-Obamaites who are called birthers, who claim that Obama was not born in the U.S. and therefore can't be president. Now, the birthers are a fringe group, they're right wing. And by using this phrase 9/11 truther, what Fleischer does is he places Eichenwald in the same sort of group, he sort of Fleischer paints Eichenwald with the brush of fanaticism and sort of fringe thinking. It's a rhetorical stratagem that Fleischer is using. Now, really, what's going on is that Fleischer is distorting Eichenwald's argument. Fleischer is claiming that Eichenwald is claiming that Bush orchestrated 9/11. That is the phrase that Fleischer uses. It's inaccurate and it's unfair. It plays into this paranoid binary in which either you accept that 9/11 was a complete surprise or somehow was orchestrated, planned, put into place deliberately by the Bush administration. But there is another explanation that's perfectly viable, and it doesn't pertain to either of the binaries that Fleischer insinuates. Instead, this third option is simply that the Bush administration did not orchestrate 9/11, but did have foreknowledge of an Al Qaeda attack. Perhaps not the attack that took place, but it had foreknowledge and wanted some form of attack to take place. It had a secret policy, in other words, to allow an attack to take place somewhere on American soil, because that would provide a pretext for a much larger military action. Now, foreknowledge, this whole question of foreknowledge of an enemy attack is an important one, and it's especially important in democracies like the United States, because in a democracy, one must accept the first blow. And when that happens, of course, then a much larger military reaction is justified. It wins massive popular support, and therefore one has to consider very carefully what it is that governments do know before apparently surprise attacks take place. One has to be very forensic in the way one looks at this whole question of foreknowledge. One has to go into great detail. The policy of accepting the first blow goes back in terms of the context with Iraq and Afghanistan to the presidency of George H.W. Bush. He claimed not to know that Saddam was going to attack Kuwait. In other words, that Iraq was planning a war against Kuwait in order to seize its oil. Now, in that situation in 1991, in the lead up to that, the general public is supposed to believe that, again, the United States did not have foreknowledge of what was happening. And you have to remember that the U.S. had spy satellites. It has spy satellites parked over the Middle East, recording everything that goes on in detail, as well as other forms of surveillance. And so we are supposed to believe that the U.S. did not see Iraqi tanks massing in the desert, and that the U.S. did not perceive beforehand that Iraq would attack Kuwait. Now, all of this is germane because effectively the United States has been fighting the same war since 1991. And again, we come back to this whole issue of context, because the war that took place in Iraq post 9/11, 2001, is supposed to be a discrete war. But if we think about what Eichenwald is saying, what he's really getting at is that the neoconservatives who were running the Pentagon when George W. Bush was elected president was that they were itching for a war with Iraq. They saw Iraq War I as unfinished business. And of course, Iraq War I was unfinished business. It was still a low-key war that was bubbling along. The United States and UK kept up a form of military action against Iraq from 1991 until 2001 by flying military Air Force missions, anti-radar missions, in which they would bomb Iraqi radar stations that they claimed were painting their planes in the no-fly zone that they created over Iraq. So there was a stream of low-key but steady bombing that was taking place. And as well, Clinton, President Clinton, late in his term, launched a very substantial air war against Iraq. So really, the conflict extended over a period of 20 years until finally the U.S. Withdrew its troops under Obama quite recently. But still, there is violence in Iraq, and of course, U.S. troops are very much they are very aware of, they're watching very keenly what takes place in Iraq, and they're positioned to return to the country if need be. Similarly, the U.S. presence in Afghanistan flowed from 9/11, allegedly, but you can trace back that particular conflict to the 1980s and President Reagan, when the U.S. decided to start supplying arms to the Taliban, and effectively the United States put the Taliban into place during the 1980s. It put it into power. Recall that Osama bin Laden was actually working with the jihadists in Afghanistan, was helping them, and was working with the CIA at that point. Now, this phrase, accept the first blow, also has a longer history, and it goes back in U.S. history, first of all, to World War II. At that point, the United States was facing off against the Nazis in Germany, the fascists in Germany and Italy. Now, Roosevelt was deeply sympathetic to the anti-fascist cause. But the United States was not fighting in that particular war, and so the Allies, the military alliance that existed against Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, was comprised in the years 1939 to 1941 of the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and for a while, until it was defeated, France. Now, the Soviet Union also joined the Allies in the summer of 1941, when the Soviets were attacked by the Germans. But effectively, for quite a long time, the Allies were the UK, Canada, Australia, and colonial possessions of the UK, such as India. The situation was not good for the Allies. The UK was hanging on by a thread. There was a lot of support within the United States for the British against Germany, but at the same time, there was a very strong isolationist movement in the United States. The two groups saw the situation of what was at that point considered a European war in very different ways. Now, U.S. sympathy for the Allies expressed itself in terms of material support, weapons, supplies, and so forth for Britain. But there wasn't enough political support to get behind the Allies militarily. So the U.S. Stayed on the sidelines. The U.S. needed a reason. It needed a unifying event in order to join World War II as a military player. And the U.S. was also supplying, when the Germans attacked Russia, the U.S. also, of course, started supplying arms to the Russians. The U.S. wanted to be an ally, but effectively on a political level, it could not be an ally until events changed the situation so that the U.S. had a politically unifying reason to join that fight. Now, the isolationist movement in the United States was very good at keeping Roosevelt from making a full-fledged commitment. And in turn, Roosevelt himself realized that if he were to go against isolationist will, he would end up entering the war with very divided public support. Now, the focus of U.S. foreign policy was very much on Europe. The Americans were watching what was happening in Europe. They were not as concerned with what was happening in Asia. And the tension that existed between the United States and Japan in Asia was really a much lesser priority for the Roosevelt administration. The Japanese were troublemaking. The Japanese themselves were involved in their own quagmire, their own ruinously expensive war in China. But the Japanese were not a direct threat to American interests. There was some interest in terms of the Philippines, which had been an American colony, but the Philippines, although included in the American defense umbrella, were not U.S. territory. Then the tension between the United States and Japan began to increase. It started to increase after the Japanese, in the fall of 1940, signed a tripartite pact with fascist Germany and Italy. So once the Japanese had formed an axis and allied themselves with the Germans and the Italians, the situation, the color of the situation changed somewhat. The United States, on the other hand, was allied with two colonial powers in Asia, which were primarily the Netherlands and the United Kingdom. And the U.S. really wanted to build up its own military forces. It wanted to build up its own navy, build up its own air force, build up its own army, and it wanted to ship most of its surplus goods, surplus weapons and so forth, to the UK and Russia. However, and because of this, some quarters in Washington thought that the Japanese problem was one too many. In the words of Roosevelt himself, he just didn't have enough navy to go around, that is, to fight the Japanese as well. What the Japanese wanted was access to U.S. oil. And in order to chastise the Japanese, the Roosevelt administration, after the Japanese signed the tripartite agreement, was to place an embargo on the Japanese. Now, this is a sort of complex issue. A journalist named Robert Stinnett, has written a book that delves into a great deal of detail about the nature of the embargo and also the nature of American strategy towards Japan just during this period. And Stinnett argues that an intelligence officer named Arthur McCollum, who drew up a plan in order to effectively put the screws on Japan, was very influential in the way that the U.S. behaved toward Japan after the tripartite agreement was signed. Now, other historians have claimed that the situation was more nuanced, and Roosevelt himself did not really want to. He wanted to use the threat of an embargo, rather a de facto embargo against the Japanese. And some historians have also pointed out that it was Dean Acheson, who was more hawkish than Roosevelt himself, who put the embargo into place. In any case, The Japanese were being squeezed by the U.S. economically, but there was no military conflict between the two powers. Now, the Japanese quagmire, it's Vietnam and China, meant that it had a huge appetite for oil. And so it looked to the oil markets in the Dutch East Indies, what we call Indonesia now, and also in the United States. It wanted oil that it could buy at market rates. Japan did not have its own oil. Meanwhile, in Europe, what was happening through the summer of 1941 was that the Russians were being hammered by the Wehrmacht. And the United Kingdom was in no position to open a second Western Front. And meantime, the United States was hamstrung politically by this domestic isolationist movement. So the tripartite agreement between Japan, Germany, and Italy, according to one argument, provided an opening for the U.S., putting the screws on Japan, following the strategy as described by Arthur McCollum, would lead very possibly to war with Japan. And war with Japan, because of the tripartite agreement, would likely lead to war with Germany. Now, the wording of the tripartite agreement was that the Germans and Italians would come to the aid of Japan if Japan was attacked by the United States, not if Japan itself attacked the United States. However, as we know, a few days after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, Hitler declared war on the United States anyway. So it was a risky strategy. It was not a strategy, if one accepts that McCollum had a secret strategy and had sway over the Roosevelt administration. The McCollum strategy was a slightly risky, dicey one. Nevertheless, it was official policy, and this was stated in transcripts and telegrams that were sent out to field commanders by senior members of Roosevelt's administration, like George Marshall. It was official policy that if war were to come with Japan, that the United States would accept the first blow. That was the phrase that was actually used. And the Roosevelt administration, I mean, this is, again, when one thinks about differences between public perceptions and what is historically the fact, what is interesting about the summer and autumn of 1941, just before Pearl Harbor, was that the United States was perfectly aware that Japan was building up for some form of military action against Southeast Asia. The Japanese were preparing to attack Hong Kong, Singapore, the Netherlands, the Philippines. The historical question has always been: did the Roosevelt administration also know that Pearl Harbor would be a target? So there was no real surprise for the Roosevelt administration that the Japanese were preparing for an attack. And of course, once the Japanese attacked, the United States would be at war. And as history shows, Pearl Harbor was the event that led to U.S. involvement in both wars in the Pacific and the Atlantic. Now, there is also an echo in terms of this whole issue of accepting the first blow in the Korean War. In that case, the background is that the United States post-World War II occupied the southern zone of the Korean Peninsula, while the Russians occupied the northern zone. And the idea at that point was that the Russians and Americans would cooperate and rebuild Korea after decades of Japanese occupation and Japanese colonization, rather, and that Korea would be launched as an independent country after being effectively shepherded toward independence by the Russians and Americans. Now, the Americans, what happened in reality was that the Russians and Americans couldn't get along, and that there were great divisions within Korean society as well. So instead of the Korean Peninsula being unified, the American and Russian presence had the opposite effect and split the peninsula into two different newly minted sovereign nations, North Korea and South Korea. South Korea became sovereign in 1948, and North Korea became sovereign in 1949. The two new nations did not get along. They were obsessed with the idea of unifying the peninsula by force, and they started their own little war, which tended to flare up along the parallel during the summer months, and included major artillery battles, troop movements, and so forth, as well as a guerrilla war that was taking place in South Korea. Especially around the Jiri Mountains. Now, while all this was happening, while there was this very small regional conflict that very few people in the world were paying attention to, Dean Acheson gave a notorious speech in January 1950, his press club speech, in which he placed the Republic of Korea, South Korea, outside the U.S. defense perimeter. Now, this speech that Acheson gave, and this is a topic that's dealt with by both Bruce Cummings and Richard C. Thornton, this speech was given just after what we know now, that just after Stalin gave a green light to Kim Il-sung being able to buy weapons from the USSR in order to organize his own attack on South Korea. And so the question is, did Acheson know? Did the Truman administration know that North Korea was preparing to launch an attack against South Korea? And this plan to launch an attack by North Korea was set into motion in January 1950, just around the time that Acheson gave his speech. That whether intentionally or inadvertently gave a clear message to the North Koreans and the Soviets that the United States would not get involved if there was war on the Korean Peninsula. Now, because the Republic of Korea was placed outside the defense perimeter, and because Dean Acheson never took the trouble, I mean, if Acheson was mistaken, if he was making an off-the-cuff remark which was misconstrued as a policy statement, Acheson certainly never took the trouble to correct himself after his press club speech. So, in effect, the North Koreans got the signal that an attack would be tolerated. Interestingly, this whole question of the diplomatic signals sent by the United States are eerily similar to the whole question of the diplomatic signals that April Glaspie, the American ambassador to Iraq, sent to Saddam Hussein around 1990, 1991, although that's a bit of a sidebar. Now, what effectively happened was, as far as any objective outsider could tell, was that the United States had a policy of not coming to the aid of South Korea in the event of an attack. And that policy just changed overnight. When North Korea did attack, the U.S. policy did a complete about face. And as with the Japanese attack during World War II, the North Korean attack on South Korea existed within a much broader global context. Of course, the Americans were not afraid of North Korea. The North Koreans posed no threat, even a regional threat, to American territorial interests. The Americans had a huge troop placement in both the Philippines and Japan, but the North Koreans were no threat to either of those nations. The Korean War at first was purely regional. However, the Americans, and again hawks within the Truman administration, such as Acheson and Paul Nitze, were extremely worried about the USSR. And recall, too, that the Americans had a monopoly on nuclear weapons, on the atomic bomb, until 1949, when the Soviets successfully detonated their own A-bomb. And this really was a bit of a shock for the Truman administration and a bit of a wake-up call. The Japanese also successfully concluded their communist revolution in 1949. The situation in Northeast Asia, that is China, Korea, Japan, was suddenly very different in 1949 than what it was in say the late 1950s, just after World War II. Moreover, because of the Soviet acquisition of atomic weapons, the Americans felt that their balance of power had shifted dramatically in Europe. Now, in Europe, there were U.S. troops, but recall that the European powers were absolutely devastated by World War II. They didn't really have much of a military presence. On the other hand, the Soviets had a huge standing army. They had never really let go of the brutal lesson that they'd learned during World War II. So it was the Red Army that was the primary military presence within the European and Euro-Asian sphere. What hawks like Acheson and Nitze wanted was articulated in a policy document called NSC 68. And what that called for was massive increases in military spending. They wanted to increase military spending 400%. In the United States, after World War II, this would have sounded like a completely crazy idea. The Americans had won in World War II. They'd won single-handedly against the Japanese, or practically single-handedly, and they'd won as the part of the alliance, the Soviets, the UK, Canada, Australia, in Europe. And after World War II, after the huge effort that took, and the huge expenditures that took, there was not the support among the American public for another round of arms increases. This whole idea of having a massive military after World War II just would have struck the average voter as kind of crazy. So the policy aims of NSC 68, this huge increase in military spending, did not have political support. However, when the Korean War happened, the Korean War was, from point of view of the hawks, a good thing. A small war can be used as a pretext to massively increase military spending, and that's exactly what happened in the case of the Korean War. The Korean War needs to be placed within the much larger context of the Cold War. In other words, the Korean War led to whether intentionally or not, led to what the Truman administration hawks wanted, which was a big buildup in Europe, a big U.S. military buildup in Europe against to face off against the Red Army. So what one finds in all these cases, in the case of Japanese militarism in 1941, North Korean aggression in 1950, Iraqi aggression in 1991, and the terror attacks in 2001, is that these relatively small wars, and I'm using the term relatively with some, qualification, but in terms of a global context, these were not attacks by one superpower against another superpower. In all these situations, in all these four situations, small war is used as a pretext to massively increase military spending, and I think that is a way to frame questions that one asks about how George W. Bush and his administration behaved in the months before 9/11, because certainly in the years following 9/11, massive increases in military spending is what we've ended up with.